Hello and welcome to Goals Driven Life YouTube channel for another live interview on a Saturday. And I can't contain my excitement about who we have today. Last week we had Udisi, who, as we all know, is known to be godmother of Silicon Valley. But thought-provoking conversation that was. And today we have another inspiring guest. But before I introduce him, I would like to give you like 3 seconds to quickly subscribe to the channel, because the beautiful ideas our guests share should reach to more people, and I too get motivated when more people subscribe. So 1, 2, and 3. Thank you. And you can also pose your questions here through YouTube comments, and I will pick them as suitable. And the questions will also be visible on the screen. Now, this is going to be a long introduction, and it's worth listening through the long introduction for the sheer impact of what the guest today and his organization has brought to the world. And you will know why in a brief moment. Yancey Strickler is a writer, speaker, and co-founder of Kickstarter. He has appeared widely across media around the world and has been profiled in Wired, the Financial Times, New York Times, Forbes, and Vox. He was one of Fortune's 40 under 40 most influential people, World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. The Spectator called him one of the least obnoxious tech evangelists ever. Super impressive, that is. So let's understand first what Kickstarter is and why it is such a precious gift to the world. Kickstarter redefined the rules of the game. The crowdfunding platform proved to the world that crowds have deep pocket, and when they rally behind a creator or an innovator, they see to it that the projects succeed. The kindness of strangers has helped a plethora of innovators from all over the world. Projects from documentary films to Oscar-winning movies to innovative new technologies are funded by crowds in Kickstarter. The most favorite of mine were Pebble watches and the super successful Peloton. But some of the projects are also very interesting, like restoring Neil Armstrong's space suit. Yancey started the company in 2009, and since then, more than $2 billion have been pledged to nearly 100,000 projects. Kickstarter has had meteoric success over the years, but when it began, it had humble beginnings. And that stands tall, but about Kickstarter, it's not about the impressive rise, but its mission for altruism over profit. Kickstarter is not a platform built on the premise for financial maximization, but creative maximization. What it means is that Kickstarter is a public benefit corporation where they have drafted a charter that all of the decisions must balance the interest of shareholders with financial maximization and with producing benefits for the society. It's core part of their decision-making process. The secrets of their platform is that the money that was in Kickstarter project had no financial upside. Kickstarter pledges aren't investments, but just support creative ideas in the world. His first book, This Could Be Our Future, a manifesto for more generous world, wages a war against the default philosophy that corporates run, which is profit maximization. Wall Street Journal says that the book is a consciousness raising. Adam Grant says it's audacious and elevating. I finished reading the groundbreaking book just this morning in preparation for this interview, and it just exploded my mind. I couldn't help thinking what a messed up world we have managed to create. He's a rare individual who is not just pointing fingers at what is wrong with the world, but is actually offering practical solutions. A framework for a better world. And the solution is not just for the heads of state and businesses, but for every individual living in this world. And that is why I was mightily fascinated by the book. In fact, I will try out this model live here in this show while we are conversing with Yancey. So with that, let's welcome our guest here.
You said it all. What else needs to be said? I think we're good. We can all just go enjoy our Saturdays now.
Hello, Yancey. Welcome to Goals Driven Life YouTube channel. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. What's up? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. As I said, Yancey, I just finished your book, and it's still weighing heavy on my mind. But it's a quite serendipity because while reading your book, and I started it last week, um, I came across Adam Grant's list of upcoming books for summer, and I always look forward to Adam Grant's list. He always comes up with a list of all the exciting books that are coming
Mm-hmm.
in the stores. And one of the lists he picked was Jacqueline Novogratz, the CEO of Acumen, her new book, Manifesto for a Moral Revolution,
Yeah.
Practices to Build a Better World. And one of my previous guests was Chip Conley, who was a mentor to Airbnb and a big hospitality giant, who also shares about measuring the right metrics, and he highlights the wrongs of GDP. So it seems like there is a growing crop or voices from some of the influential people like you, Jacqueline, and Chip, who are venting their resentment against what's wrong with the world, misplaced priorities, and warped agenda of corporates. So, what do you say about it? Do you see that this sentiment is growing?
It definitely is. I mean, I think in a post-COVID world, all of our dashboards have expanded, right? Like the primary dashboard of Western life for the past 30 years has been the stock market. And we're taught to feel happy when the stock market is going up and sad when it's going down, even though 80% of Americans don't really have ownership in the stock market. But we sort of pin and peg our notion of self-worth to that scale, to that graph. But now, during COVID, the monopoly of that graph is challenged. Now it's not just financial valuations that matter, although that is still part of the story, right? But it's also public health that matters. It's also increasingly going to be unemployment and poverty that matters. And so what we're going to see is that our dashboard of what we're meant to integrate into our thinking to judge our happiness or unhappiness with the broad contours of life, say outside of our family and friends, that story's gotten more complicated. And what's interesting and what's so striking about this moment is watching wealth just accelerate and increase. The markets continue to go up, right? Markets are up now even higher than they were before this began, because power is not changing. Power is still accruing and even growing in a small number of hands. So those people pumping up financial valuations this moment, they are recognizing that the world is working even more in their favor. And so there is I think that this is a recognition of the power struggle of the world. And this is going to become an even bigger problem, because we are, entering and already are in a financial and economic catastrophe. But what we're going to find is that for the top 10% of people, they're going to make out even better, and the other 90% will get screwed. And so even as we say, like, even in the Great Depression of the 1930s, it's like, well, if the Rockefellers lost some of their fortune, whatever, everyone is decimated to some degree. You have these stories. That's not going to be the case here. People who have ownership will get wealthier, others will not. So it reveals that GDP is a hollow metric, that it is a counting metric that counts what it is intended to count, but that what it's counting, which is just the gross amount of wealth and money that changes hands, has just only the slightest relevance to human lives. And so, the past 30, 40 years, as GDP and financial mindset has overtaken things, there have been great voices raising challenging that. What people have struggled with is to say, well, what else is there? What is there instead? Because it is quite hard to run an organization or to live a life without, like, the name of this show says it, but without a goal to work towards. If it's just like, okay, just go do your thing. And, a lot of people are going to struggle in that situation. So, like, money, just saying, go make money, simplifies things for a lot of people. So if you want to replace that, or if you want that to go away, you have to replace it with something better. I mean, that's the point of competition. And so I think that day is finally coming. I think that where we are in the life cycle of technology and the sort of things we're able to measure, and even, I don't think it's 100% directly related, but even the rise of crypto and new ways of creating currency all show that the position of wealth is being competitively challenged, and I think will be financial valuation will continue to be a central metric that we think about, but it's going to get balanced with public health. It's going to get balanced with environmental impact, and eventually we may find our way to like a new kind of overall metric that's like wealth minus those things, like where we are able to incorporate those things into a single score. But just dashboards are incredibly important, and they influence us significantly, and our ability to process new information is tremendous. We underestimate our ability to do that. If you just even think about how, like, we've learned to, we don't quite know how to do the full calculation, but like the meaning of calories in food is a relatively recent thing. That's like a decade or two old. That's a totally new metric. Before, food was it was a simple matrix of like cost and do I want it or not. Now there's this third, which is like, is it good for me or not? And some people are bad at navigating that. Some people are still buying, food that is bad for them, probably because of cost. But that is a language that we've learned that shifts decisions. And it's just the same thing's going to happen in more areas of life. And that, I absolutely believe that change is already underway and accelerating because of COVID.
I like that hopeful tone of yours. I was under great stress when last few weeks, especially, I do not know if you have followed news in India, due to the lockdown, the entire country of 1.2 billion people was locked down. And who gets hit whenever there is a calamity like this? It's always the people at the lowest of the pyramid gets hit. So there was this big migrant crisis. All the migrants who moved from their original cities, from their villages to the cities, they all lost their jobs. And because all the transport, trains, buses were all locked, these people lost jobs and did not have food to eat. And they had to walk thousands of miles back home, and most of them dying out of hunger while walking back home. So it was a big migrant crisis, and I could not stop myself thinking that how screwed up we are with in the ways we have. I mean, it evolves for the better, but it did not look like.
I mean, this is a moment that it's begging for the world to come together. It's begging for it, right? Because COVID, we're all susceptible. We're all like everyone. Truly, we are all like needing to look after one another in the biggest ways. And it's like Mother Nature sent this to tell us this. But of course, because of really, I think primarily because a handful of leaders around the world, this is not happening. It's not happening, and it's like, it's hard to even put into words just what like even saying it's a waste feels too flippant for what it is. I mean, in the United States right now, I mean, this is a very during the United States, an arm of the government, law enforcement, is trying to create a new civil war. Like, there are white supremacists who join the police and who join the military, and there is a goal of a new civil war and a whitening of America. And like, that's happening right now. That is happening. And these are things that we are not prepared for. And that for any, and I'm using the traditional liberal phrase, any liberal thinker that just believes in freedom, expression, all these sorts of things, like, it's very hard to know how to combat something like this, right? We're told the pen is mightier than the sword, but hey, what about those guys with swords? What is that supposed to be? And the world is pulling that way, and even though it is a minority point of view, for sure, most people do not want these things. Even people who are politically support these candidates, I think, may not actually want these things. But you get on these paths, and it's very unclear how to get off. And so, I'm quite pessimistic about the very near future. But I do still remain optimistic about, especially just the human capacity to evolve, about the amount of critical information to our survival that we have yet to learn, that we're going to learn, which I have every faith will happen. And so I think our capacity to improve and get better is tremendous. And like I am long on humanity, for sure. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of darkness.
Sure. So we'll talk about the problems of the world. Let's talk about you first. A lot of me and lots of my audience are very curious about knowing you a little deeper. So, what were your growing years like? What shaped you? What influenced you in your formative years to become what you became today?
Yeah, well, I grew up on a farm in Virginia, which is like the southern southeast United States. I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains, which is like where bluegrass and country music comes from. So I come from that world,
Mhm.
um, and I, just growing up, all I did was read books, because you live in the country, you don't have many neighbors, and I always dreamed of the outside world while also growing up evangelical Christian and being quite active in church, going to a religious school. Um, but my dream was to be a writer. I was especially inspired by books like All the President's Men, and just journalism was quite inspiring to me, and that was my goal in life. I went to university and studied writing and philosophy, and I moved to New York City afterwards with a high school friend, kind of a last second move. And I moved to New York wanting to make it as a writer. And about 3 months after arriving, I got my first job there, and it was rewriting news stories to be read out on the radio. So if you listen to the radio station, sometimes the DJ will give a news brief. Here's what's happening in the world. Well, I would write those, and so I would have to turn news stories into like little 30-word blurbs that were fun to listen to. And so that was my job for my first 3.5 years in New York, while also, writing about bands and stuff on the side for magazines and newspapers, whoever would pay me, and just loving that, and loving being a part of this scene. I mean, the music scene in New York City in the early 2000s was very exciting. A lot of great artists were there, and you'd go to shows and basements and see people that went on to become very famous. Like that was a thing that just happened. And it was during that time that I made a new friend, a guy named Perry Chen, and he worked at a restaurant in Brooklyn that was like the coolest restaurant in New York, where I would go often, and we got to be buddies. And he had this idea for crowdfunding. He had been living in New Orleans in 2001, and had wanted to host a concert, but found out it was going to cost him like 20 grand up front to put it together, and he didn't want to accept that risk on his own, couldn't do it. So he had this idea of, what if I proposed the concert online, and people would put up their credit cards, but no one would be charged unless the show sold out. And this way he wouldn't have to make this decision. Instead, everyone would make this decision. And when we started working on it, I didn't like the idea at first. I thought this sounded like American Idol, and how bad art got made. But we really connected on it. And what we especially connected on was the idea that a model like this, people would be funding ideas not because there might be a good investment, not because, oh, this movie might be a hit, but you would fund ideas just because you like the artist. For me, who loves the movies of David Lynch, like I would give him money to do whatever he wanted. But yet in the world before Kickstarter, even like the giants of cinema could only get a green light if their next project seemed like it might sell some popcorn. So we were very driven by the idea of there should be a whole separate economy where projects are funded not because of their financial potential, but simply because people like them. And people can like them for all kinds of reasons, because the idea is cool, because their neighborhood needs it, because the creator is cute, because it's your friend, like whatever. Like these are all very valid reasons why something should happen. And so Kickstarter was like that universe. And for me, what was interesting for me is I had no desire to be an entrepreneur. Like I'm a country boy who loved writing and who's just curious about the world. Like I'm still kind of like the small town kid looking at the world with big eyes, just so amazed by everything that's out there. And but like the power of the Kickstarter idea was so strong that we became entrepreneurs to make this idea real. We had to learn to start a company. We had to learn to do a lot of things that we didn't, really know how to do before. And especially for us, Charles Adler, also founder, the three of us, we're all sort of creative people. We come from more artistic backgrounds. And there was a real feeling of like, you're crossing a boundary. You're almost being a bit of a class trader to go from being an artist to more of a business person. Like it feels like a kind of a sellout. But yet we could also see that like, there's no one looking out for people like us in this business world. And who's it going to be? Like, who's going to think about the needs of like, not financially motivated creative people? Like nobody's going to care. And so we have to care, so we have to learn how to do these things. So, becoming an entrepreneur was entirely about just believing in the power of the idea and feeling like if it's not us, it's, it needs to be us. Everyone else is going to screw this up. No one else is going to think about the people we're thinking about. And so that feeling of like being deeply compelled made it easier, and also like gives an added motivation to learn things you don't know how to do.
Just curious, usually when people imagine to build something, especially as a scale of yours, you usually pivot a few things and then you try to iterate a bit. Did Kickstarter become what you exactly imagined, or was it a variant of your initial idea?
Well, it was Perry's first idea, but it was exactly. I mean, it got honed. There was a first mock-up that we made in 2005 that looks very similar to Kickstarter even today. What happened was there was, because it took so long to get off the ground, there was a couple of years where we had enough time to like dream on what else it could be, and to like really to bloat it up, just to create a bloated product. If you have time, you'll just create a bloated product. Well, of course we need this feature, and of course we need this feature. And also during that time, you're meeting with like, I mean, this is 2006, 2007. The site didn't launch till 2009. So we're still years from launching. But like, we got meetings with record labels, people that, I knew that we were connected with, and we're pitching the idea. And yeah, no one likes it. And of course we're rolling in like, we got you covered. What you need, how much money you need. Like, it's cool. And just foolishness. So there was that period where it's like, okay, it's going to be all the things. Let's make it all the things. We're going to build it. Why not do it? And then building it becomes really hard. And that was a very painful process. And it became so hard that in the end, and we weren't trying to build those ideas so much, but in the end, we really just shaved down the product to like the very core. And one thing that we always talked about was like, people can only accept one new idea at a time. So like, let's let the new idea be the model. Let's let the model be the new idea. Let's try to make everything else as familiar as possible. And just let the model be the new thing that people are taught. And, what's funny is that like the pledging, not being charged until the end, all or nothing funding, all of these mechanisms of crowdfunding are now like so normal. I can't tell you how much time was spent explaining those things. And during the first 3 years, every single Kickstarter project video was someone explaining how it worked. That's all it would be. They would first say, I'm Allison here. I'm going to make my record. But first, let me tell you how Kickstarter works. And then it would be like a 45-second, infomercial explaining all or nothing. And the people had to do it because no one had any idea. I mean, what a made up model. I put up my credit card, but you don't charge me now. And I get charged based on what other people do, right. Like for real. And, but what was exciting was like, it was about 3 years in, people stopped including those explainers in their videos. And I realized, oh, people understand now, people get it. But just watching like that new model, I mean, a totally new form of transaction. And how many new transactions are there on the internet? There's not a lot. But this was really like a new language that people had to learn.
Tell us about your first project there, and also tell us about what have you learned over the years running Kickstarter.
Um,
Not you.
well, the very first project was by Perry to make a T-shirt that failed. The second project was by me and him and a friend of ours, Claudia, to make a book that succeeded, and that was cool. The idea was, let's make 100-page book, and let's have 100 backers. And if you pledge $30, you get a copy of the book, and you get one page to put whatever you want on it. So it'd be 100-page book with 100 authors. And so we did that. I still have the book. I was unpacking the other day. I came across it, called New York Makes a Book. So that was cool. The first project to hit its goal was from an illustrator who said, if you give me $5, I'll draw you a picture of something. And he raised $35 from 3 people, which was like a massive validation for us. But, the learnings, one was like, just seeing how the platform got validated community by community. There's never been any marketing spend for Kickstarter, like still hasn't. So it's all word of mouth. But I remember very distinctly, maybe about 4 months in, we made it for the first couple of years. You had to sort of pitch and apply to start a project. We gated access. It was invite only. So there was scarcity around starting a Kickstarter project. And if you wanted to start one, you either had to know someone who'd already started one, and they got 5 invites to share, or you had to write into Kickstarter. If you wrote into Kickstarter, you wrote to me. And so I talked with all these people who wanted to start projects during the first year. But I distinctly remember it was about 3 or 4 months after we were live, we had our first Indian classical dance project. I just remember, I like Indian classical music, but it was the first Indian classical dance project that was just notable to me. It just stuck out. And then within 2 weeks, there were like 10 others from all across the country. It was still only the US. I think the first one was in Chicago. And then suddenly there were ones all around the rest of the US. And it was like, oh, wow, it's like contact tracing organic growth. We're like, I can see how this one community, the product got validated because that first choreographer dance company, they emailed all their friends to say, hey, support our new season. Those friends had dance companies of their own. They say, oh, what is this thing? They see it working for their friend. They try it. And it's just this way that you can see how communities and platforms perpetuate. And because the niches on Kickstarter are so specific, you could really see it happen one by one. The other thing that just really was obvious was we had our inflection point when projects started raising more than $1 million in funding. And this happened 3 years after we launched. 2012, the first ones to cross $1 million happened. And the culture of the site changed. Before then we were always the same thing. We were, you're an artist looking to make a project. Once people started making more than $1 million, we suddenly became like the internet's lottery ticket. This sort of channel that had never existed before, where just anybody with a good idea could make $1 million overnight, seemingly. And it happened. It happened every week. And it was a great story and it was exciting. But we quickly became concerned with it because we saw, we'd always invested so much in protecting the site that our reputation was incredible. But we could see how people were sort of, maybe creators were burning the goodwill of our reputation by maybe running projects that weren't as straightforward as we thought they should be. And also maybe people were trusting Kickstarter too much because there was just this irrational exuberance. Right. So in the midst of this moment where like so much money is coming in the door, you don't even know what to do, we announced these like quite draconian rules called Kickstarter is not a store that were explicitly intended to limit the amount of money that people could raise. We wanted to put a damp cloth on what was happening. And it was, people were very upset. Like that post got 500 plus comments, all some variant of FU. And people were quite upset about it, but we felt certain that for the long-term health of the platform, we needed to slow the roll, and that people were just getting too ahead of themselves. And, later on and it wasn't long after that the questions of, the follow through on Kickstarter projects did become a big focal point and something that we saw coming. But, it was just interesting to watch what happens as a platform becomes popular. One is just that the culture of the site changes. Two is that everything professionalizes, right? The Kickstarter before that moment, everyone is just like making a bad video with their iPhone camera, and it's fine. That's actually like the language of the site. After people started raising a lot of money, suddenly people began hiring professional video crews to make their Kickstarter videos. And so the bar got raised. We didn't like it. You try to, you editorially highlight the projects that feel more like the old culture, but still the projects that get spread and shared the most are the ones that feel more professional. And then suddenly your user-generated open platform that's about enabling anything that people might imagine, somehow the stakes get higher. You saw this happen with the App Store. In the App Store, like Flappy Bird becomes this major, breakout game that everyone's trying. Everyone immediately starts making their own games. There's no chance that happens now, right? Because it's like it's 5 games, game firms that are controlling that, and it's just very hard to break in because the bar gets raised so high. So a lot of after that inflection point, an incredible amount of Kickstarter's energy, and it's still to this day, I'm sure, goes into trying to how do you govern a system where there is this professional class and this explicitly not as professional class, which is the intended purpose of the site, is to serve those folks. And so how do you do that? How do you manage that? And that's quite challenging. But so overall, I would say that there's a lot of choices that we made with Kickstarter early on that have allowed it to still be relevant and meaningful 11 years in. And I think one of the biggest was that we agreed from the beginning as co-founders that we never wanted to sell the company or go public, that success would not be a cash out, that success would be the long-term meaningfulness of the platform. And where that was especially helpful is that we raised very little money. The Series A, the only real institutional money we raised was about 4 months after we launched, and that was less than $1 million from some. On my camera, sorry. That was like $1 million from some amazing investors, but we told them going in, like, there's no exit here. The idea is to just do the same thing forever, and that if the company is successful, that there are dividends or, there's buybacks that happen every now and then. But just like the profit is being shared as the company is successful. And the benefit of that is just by not taking so much money, we avoided a lot of the pressure that comes with outside investors. A couple of our competitors raised like more than $50 million in funding from the biggest VCs in tech explicitly to take us on while I was CEO. Those are moments where you think maybe we have to do the same. Maybe you have to match that escalation. And it did make things competitively harder for a couple of years. But you know what? Those companies ended up being in a much harder place by taking that money because they made a lot of bad decisions. And, having your freedom to choose as you see fit is a huge bonus. Big venture capital funding rounds are basically post-dated checks. Once you take that money, all of your choices are reverse engineering to that outcome. And so all decisions become about growth and financial growth. And certainly financial growth is important. But if you build a business only chasing financial growth, no one's going to care about you. No one's going to give a shit about you. It is a thin victory, and it is short-lived. So I think that notion of success, which a lot of tech is still on that playbook, I think is a false one, and that it is this long-term meaning of just playing the infinite game where if you're alive, you're winning. That's actually the way that businesses should operate.
So we all thank you for not selling it out and retaining the soul of it, and we love you for that. Just one question about I heard you say in one of the interviews that Kickstarter was not just about valuable projects, right? So there were some weird projects like the sensex of rabbits in I think somebody's backyard or something.
Yeah.
Why? And you said that no one else would ever give them money to run those projects. Could you explain that, and why is that philosophy so important for such ideas?
Yeah, well, if you are, if you're doing anything and you need money, if you're going to a bank or any traditional funder, they're asking, well, what's the return? Let's model out this return. When do I get my money back? When do I make my money? What's my investment? If you're going to some cultural funder, they're saying, well, why should I fund you and not this other thing? The other thing, they've got a big star attached, and it has more explosions, so that's what we're going to put money into. So this is just this litmus test that ideas are judged on in our world, which is their ability to make someone else money. We implicitly assume that the right decision in any choice is whichever option makes the most money. That is the invisible assumption of the world today. And it's a defensible assumption in many ways, but there's so much that's left out of that. What we just saw as artists and creative people is that just there's that ideas that will make money encompasses about 0.01% of ideas, and all other ideas are simply, and especially creative ideas, those are like things in your head that you can't shake. And the motivation to create as an artist is to manifest the idea in your head in a way that it is represented in the physical world in a way that feels like what you saw, what you felt in your mind. And that is the goal. And other people appreciating that is also part of the goal, but that is a sub goal. And becoming wealthy off of that is like a sub goal. But yet the cultural industry only accounted for projects where someone wanted to get rich. And it's the same thing with companies now, like a traditional funding, it only accounts for companies that want to make a lot of money. If you don't want to do that, if you want to have impact in other kind of ways, you are just simply incompatible with the system. You are speaking a different language, and it does not know what to do with you. It does not know what to do with you. And that's why we as creative people felt so alienated from the world of business, why we felt like traitors for going into it. But as we've had success, and knowing who we were and knowing that it was unusual to be the people we were and to have this kind of success, our mindset quickly shifted to let's try to be a role model. Let's try to be a role model. Like, hey, all right, we're the ones who got in the door. Well, we know there are a lot of smart people like us who would make amazing businesses or amazing, organizations, but who feel alienated and cut out. Well, how can we validate this for them? And how can we create a different path? And so eventually Kickstarter, in 2015, we converted Kickstarter to become a public benefit corporation, which is a type of company where you are, it's a for-profit company. You are legally required to think about shareholders as traditional for-profit companies are, but you are required to balance that with producing a positive benefit to society. And to us, this was about still carving out this path that just stayed away from the herd. I remember once doing an analogy to the company, showing like these shipping lanes where all these boats cross the Atlantic, and then just showing this tiny boat going off in its own direction and being like, this is us. And our hope is that if we find this path, that others will follow, and that the hardest thing to do is to cut through the jungle, to be the first one to say, hey, I found a place. But for us, trying to build a new norm around creating businesses that are maximizing non-financial values, and that are serving communities and creating meaning and value for communities, but in a way where the ultimate outcome is not financial growth, but is something else. To say that that's totally valid, and that when the next entrepreneur has an idea like that they can say to whoever people they're trying to get a green light from, they're saying, hey, I'm doing the Kickstarter model. And if they can say they're doing a model rather than I can't, I just don't like things, I'm going to try to do it differently. But if instead they can say, here's a successful role model I'm following, then maybe they do get that green light, and maybe this can become a norm for a different way of building a business.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's come to the core of why we are here and to understand the manifesto for a generous world that you imagine. You have been vocal about financial maximization as a philosophy for vocal against financial maximization as a philosophy for entrepreneurship. what is the core problem there? Because I always imagine, and we have been trained to learn this, that all human progress, innovation, um, human progress has resulted because of entrepreneurship. Where do you see is the fundamental problem there?
Um, well, I mean, entrepreneurship feels like reclaiming. I mean, that's a world where you're like saying spiritual leaders are entrepreneurs and tribal leaders are entrepreneurs. Anyone that does anything is an entrepreneur. To me, that's just like turning a word into nothing to try to claim whatever you want. Has the world depended on, individuals taking risks? Yes. Has it depended on groups of people coming together and manifesting ideas? Yes. I think that, in the book I write about, I trace back our belief in money, and earlier I said we have this sort of assumption that the right choice in any decision is whichever option makes the most money. And one of the points I make in my book is that this belief is recent, that we maybe think that this is how people have always thought. But actually, if you go back and do the research, it's really like 50 years ago or so that this notion that financial value and money was the only value worth thinking about really came into the mainstream. It happened in the 1970s. And before then, the notion of what was good or valuable had much more of a moral component. And that what's happened is that, we were a world that used to be dominated by moral values, but moral values are complicated and they're relative, and our own cultural experiences create different languages for what our moral values are. And so even, if you're doing a classic Socratic dialogue, even trying to decide where to get lunch together can take forever if you're only communicating on a moral value level. So the solution that economics created was financial value, which was simply to create a hard measurement that would be an approximation of goodness. And I picture like moral values and financial value as being on a spectrum, and that the creation of financial value was like a way to express those moral values as a number, as a way to make them something that was transferable and tradable. And so the story of the last 50 years is that moral values were overtaken by financial value, and for all kinds of rational reasons, like it's financial value is universal, it's tradable, it has utility. Moral values are personal, subjective, they're untradable. And so for lots of rational reasons that made all kinds of sense, the world has just shifted into, well, whatever is worth the most money must be what's right. We assume that number tells us everything. And of course it doesn't. And people have tried to argue this for years. The writer Donella Meadows, who wrote The Limits of Growth, is maybe the single best person at arguing the limits of these things. But the challenge has been, well, what is missing? Right? Like, if it is that, then what's not there? I read a quote by Milton Friedman, him meeting with these other economists, and the head of the World Bank, Klaus Schultz, asked the economists, what do you think, how do you feel about the state of your profession? And Milton Friedman, all these other Nobel Prize winning economists shocked him by saying, well, actually, we think that there's something missing. When we look at economics, we think it still fails to understand really human behavior. And I think I know why. So, the history of capitalism goes back to Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations, and the idea that you can trust people to operate according to their self-interest, and that you create a permission, sort of a post-permission society where you just trust everyone to do what's right for them, and then this flourishing can happen. And I think this is true. I think what Adam Smith said is true. I think the error is that our assumption of what our self-interest is too narrow, that we assume self-interest is an individualistic, immediate desire, that self-interest is now me, what I want right now. And so the way we think of capitalism and the way we think of the rationality of it is that it only works as if we're all going out and getting what we want right now. And that desire to be fed, that desire for dopamine hit, the desire for all those things, that's what makes the engine run. That's what makes growth happen. That's what, like, envy and desire, creating more financial, activity, all that sort of stuff is that story. But our self-interest is far bigger than that. It's far bigger than that. In the book, I introduce a philosophy that I came up with while thinking about this problem. And it happened, I was just thinking a lot about this question of self-interest. And I spent like over a year, just reading about the history of self-interest and the history of value. How did we come to decide on money? How have we defined the self throughout the years? And it was fascinating to see, because there's been a lot of people really glomming on to financial value and this like very limited notion of self-interest. And so one day I was sort of doodling in my notebook, and I was trying to draw self-interest, and I drew a hockey stick graph. This is one of those charts where it's just like a line going up and to the right, like just something's growing so fast it's going through the roof. On the x-axis is time, now going to the future, and the y-axis is your self-interest. And as I looked at this simple hockey stick graph in my notebook, it occurred to me that this was just a tiny slice of a much larger picture, because the x-axis representing time, it kept going from now as far into the future as you might want. And the y-axis representing our self-interest, it also keeps going, because as our self-interest grows, so do our responsibilities. The difference between being single and having a family is huge, or being a solo entrepreneur and having employees. So as our self-interest grows, it goes from me to us. Right. We're not just thinking about ourselves, we have to think about other people. That is what happens when your self-interest grows, whether you like it or not. And so when I expanded this graph, I suddenly found that whereas self-interest going in, I thought was just this tiny hockey stick space, it was actually 4 dimensions. It was 4 boxes. There was now me in the bottom left, what I want and need right now.
Let me share the box so that the audience can
we could show it.
Yeah, I have you call it the bento box, right?
I'll explain the name. If you could put it up on screen. But in the bottom left, you have a box of now me that represents what I want to need right now. And the bottom right is future me. Future me is the older, wiser version of me, the person I hope to become. And the top left is now us, the people I care about and who care about me. And the top right is future us, my kids if I have them, or everybody else's kids if I don't. And what I saw when I looked at this is I realized that even though all I'm really taught to think about is now me, that is the only rational space, in reality, like I leave a footprint in all of these spaces. Every decision I make shapes my future me. They become real or not real based on what I do on a day-to-day basis. My now us, they're shaped by everything I do. And yet here I am operating in a way that I'm blind to everything other than this one corner. So when I drew this graph, I thought, what is this a picture of? And I wrote next to it a simple description. I just wrote beyond near-term orientation. Like this solves for the way we hyper-focus on the near term. And I suddenly realized that was an acronym for bento. And it made me think about the bento box, the Japanese packed meal, where you have 4 compartments and a lid that always lets you have a variety of dishes, not too much of any one thing. And the bento also honors this Japanese dieting philosophy called Hara Hachibu, which says the goal of a meal is to be 80% full. That way you're still hungry for tomorrow. So I thought Bentoism is the same idea, but for our values and our self-interest, a way to not just indulge in now me, but to leave space for the future, leave space for others. And I'm convinced that this is a truer reflection of what self-interest actually is. And that if we are taught to make decisions from the perspective of not just thinking about our now me selves, but our future me selves, the people we care about and the future us, that our choices look dramatically different, because the bento, it shows us where we get trapped in a world where we only see now me. That makes something like addiction, something that is good for now me, but bad for your future self, bad for other people. That looks rational. Or if all you see is now me, it makes sacrifice, giving up something now to get more later, or for other people to have more, it makes that seem irrational. And so it just boxes you into this, literally boxes you into this very small subset of choices that actually are to your detriment. And so the step to move beyond this, it isn't to rewrite the whole world. It isn't to blow it all up. It's simply to expand the perimeter of our self-interest. It is to yes and on what's already here. It's to say, yes, people are functioning according to their self-interest is what people should do. However, we should properly educate ourselves and what the implications of our actions really are. Of course, we want to become the people we want to become. And thinking about that is a critical part of human development. Of course, we depend on communities and networks of people, and integrating that into our thinking as individuals and organizations, of course, is table stakes for even being a part of this. But yet today, everything other than now me is considered emotional or irrational and not worth making decision or optimizing for. And this is where we are stuck. And this is where the belief in money as the only important denominator to grow traps us. And so I believe that the bento is a map. It's a map to, the phrase I use a lot is coherence. Coherence. In physics, coherence refers to when multiple light waves are balancing back and forth in harmony, and it creates like a perfect image, right? That coherence will generate this harmonic perfection. I mean, perfect is the wrong word, but it's these things being in sync. And so the power of individual or organizational coherence is even stronger. And this is seeking to make decisions or green light projects that satisfy the needs and desires of every part of the bento. To make choices that are in your now me self-interest, that are what your future me wants, that is good for your now us, that is good for your future us. And what we find, and we make choices like these regularly, we have these perfect swings where we find a way, but what we find is that choices like those are so much more successful. They amplify so much more. They work out so much better. The time your company launches a product and it just nails it and everyone loves it, it's because you are lighting up the coherence of all these different dimensions of yourself. When things fail to achieve what you want them to, it's because you're not accounting for all these spaces. So this idea of developing an inner coherence and an ability to be in integrity with what you most want and what the people in the world around you most needs is just an incredibly helpful map, a kind of compass to creating meaning and value. And instead, we're at a point now where we're just all meant to be in our isolated silos, maximizing our now me self-interest. And the moments when we happen to collaborate or coordinate are like these serendipitous, oh my God, I can't believe the luck. Like two people bumped into each other, both working on the same selfish thing at the same moment, and they didn't fight. What a miracle. And so there's just no notion of real cooperation, of real collaboration, of the shared space that truly exists. So I am convinced that whether bento is the exact phrase or not, I care less about, than the fact that the dimensions of self-interest are the thing to change. And if we see our self-interest more properly, there's a whole series of changes that happen as a result of that. Our how we define value changes. It's not just financial value. It has to be different forms of value. And I think what constitutes a good decision, a bad decision changes. And my research would suggest that this is something we can absolutely, that this is changeable. And that my thesis in the book is that this takes 30 years. This takes 30 years to go from a totally new idea becoming so normal that people don't even remember it being a new idea anymore. And so that is the mission I am on. And I believe that if we more properly define self-interest, I'm just convinced that a lot of other decisions we make now start to look very different, and that this is the kind of deeper foundational change that makes the other kinds of changes that are necessary, say like business leaders or political leaders making quote unquote better decisions. I think it makes it possible, because I don't think that happens by leaders getting equally woke, everyone like following the same Twitter accounts. That comes from a deeper moral reassessment. And I believe that this is the level at which that needs to happen.
Right. So all this while I had known you as the founder of Kickstarter, I never knew this side of you until I read the book, and I was blown away. I, being a product manager, I'm a fan of 2x2 matrices. And when I saw such a powerful concept encapsulated into 2x2, I was fascinated, and I did not know if you can iterate on it, and I think you can build on it. Right? You said that your future self is your son, and he has this generational value he carries on to his
Yeah.
side, and it grows on top of that. Could you explain that?
Yeah. No, in the end of the book, I show how the bento maps not just like your choices of today, but it maps what generational changes look like. A lot of the book, I show these larger generational shifts and how opinions that are so normal to us now, like 50 years ago, were, you would have been so weird to think the things that you think, and to demonstrate how that change gradually happens. So if you imagine that, if you picture that same bento, and that top right was that future us, you can imagine that future us is your child. And so if you extend your bento, if you build out theirs on top of yours, what you see is that your values underline who they are. So imagine that future us is your child. Well, the future me, which is your values as a parent, they're a foundation that shaped them. And your now us, your relationship with you and your partner, that's a force that really pushes them out into the world. And so, and I have an illustration I do showing color, like a color bleed, but you can see how generationally we very gradually change. And that if we fail to see the whole bento, if we're only thinking from a now me perspective, then we actually have much less influence over the next generation. It's when we really accept the dimensions of ourselves and accept our power and accept our influence, that you then can really start to shape the next generation. This is something that parenting does teach you. But it just really reveals the degree to which we are not isolated actors in the universe. I think we believe what each of us does individually doesn't matter. It's just me. But we resonate, we amplify, and so even making positive choices in your life, which might seem not that important, not that meaningful, to me, this shows that they are meaningful.
Right. One of the striking things that you have shared is the contrast between old value and new value, or
Yeah.
you call it the gross domestic value. Let me just pull up that slide, and it's so fascinating to see that.
Yeah.
And you have listed the new values, which are no GDP never shows that. So this is about, so we compare, the old value is only one value. The parameter is financial value. The new value is community, sustainability, purpose, tradition, security, fairness, knowledge, well-being, mastery. Why did we ever miss these values?
So I think today everything must ladder up to a financial value, right? And if you have a new idea in your organization, you pitch it, at the end they're going to say, well, what's the growth? What is the return? What's the ROI on this? And we're in a place where we believe that financial value is the only valid ROI. But I think what we are going to discover is that investing resources, whether it's financial value or just time, into the growth of the values you see on that right-hand column, community, sustainability, mastery, purpose, we're going to find that those are far more profitable investments over the long run. And I also believe that everything on that right-hand column, that these are all things that we will learn how to measure in one degree or another. And now that measurement might first start with like, does an action harm or help this trait? But I think that these are things that we will actually be able to algorithmically determine. There's an example I write about in the book of Adele, the pop star Adele, using an algorithm that measures loyalty to distribute concert tickets as a way to undercut the winner-take-all market dynamics, fans having to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars above face value to see her perform at a show. And so to balance this, Adele uses an algorithm to specifically identify her most loyal fans and invite them to buy a ticket, people still having to pay. So Adele's still satisfying her financial needs of not losing money on the performance, but yet Adele is maximizing for a non-financial value of loyalty and a communal experience on top of her own financial needs. So this is a quite sophisticated transaction. It sounds altruistic maybe, but it's not. She is rationally distributing a good while satisfying a financial minimum, but creating a non-financial maximum on top of that. And I think that these kinds of decisions, which I would call a post-capitalist transaction, these kinds of transactions, I think, are what we're going to start to see more of, which is that price, financial value, we will continue to have as like a benchmark just to ensure that, say, businesses can continue to survive and be operational. But yet all of the value that's going to be created is not by exploiting more financial value. It's going to be by growing these other forms of value for customers, for employees, and for the business itself. And that this is how things evolve. And so, I think things like the loyalty algorithm are a great example. I think that the environmental climate crisis is going to force us to make resources used or not used, or pollutants removed, a focal point of many of our decisions if we are to have any success with stopping this disaster. And we're going to learn to just incorporate those kinds of traits, which we currently see as emotional, more nebulous, harder to be in touch with. Those are going to be, I think, more in the conversation. Because, my experience as a leader, being in like an organization that's trying to optimize, 10 out of 10 for all the right things, you still get in these situations where here's path A, it has a clear financial outcome, some things about it that seem less desirable, but they're harder to pinpoint. Here's path B, less financially advantageous. Those harder to pinpoint things don't feel as bad. 9 times out of 10, the leadership of a company is going to choose path A because the financial path is more clear. The only time you're going to choose path B is in a crisis where you feel like you have to apologize to the public for something. But yet there is, and you know what? And 9 times out of 10, path A might still be the right choice. But what we need is language that allows us to have real rational conversations rather than what happens in these situations, which is that like the CFO, the CEO, and the head of engineering have the rational argument of look what the numbers say. 3 or 4 other people who represent the more humanities departments, they say, think about this other thing. And that argument is seen as emotional or irrational. And yes, the powers that be of financial valuation, they went out in that moment. But the real challenge here is that you have smart people trying to make a reasonable discussion, trying to sort something out, but yet there's a mismatch in language, and we fail to account for these things side by side. They're seen as being in different universes, but I don't think they are. So the world I imagine is one where it's not easy to do the right thing, but it's less hard. It's less hard. Like being in that seat, I know how difficult it is to make a choice where you're giving up something. It's very difficult. You get into a fear mindset. And so what you need is just a little bit of certainty that I'm not just giving up something, but I'm getting something, that there is a trade here and that the trade is worth it. And when you're in those positions, you're looking for just the shred of justification that will let you do what your heart tells you to do. And we lack that now. But that language is there, and that knowledge can be built. And so, my personal time is being used on teaching people this model, being an evangelist for this idea, for this possibility, trying to gather and identify the projects that I think are already working on this kind of language, whether they are using the same terminology as me or not. And then I think what really the process of the next couple of decades is mathematically defining some of those new values that I showed you. It's going to be dangerous to define like community. Like these are going to be like the human assumptions that will go into algorithmically identifying these things are going to be super fraught for sure. But maybe we can start with like a weather report kind of check-in of is this good? Is it a sunny day or is it a rainy day? Can we learn that much for each of these values so that we can say, listen, if company X makes this decision, it will have a negative impact on these values, which we've previously identified as being important for our success in other kinds of ways. I think that's how better choices start to make happen. Like that's how that transition happens. It happens from it being rational, defensible, something that even people who don't care about these kinds of moral issues, that they can see that is still in their self-interest to care, because it will produce an outcome that they desire. I think that is how behavior changes at scale. And to me, the bento and then the steps that happen as a result of that is a plausible map to getting there. I get that it's still a long shot, the idea that we may all suddenly see ourselves in a bigger way, but there's another argument that would actually say the real story of history has just been of an expansion of consciousness over time. Like that, going back to the first beginnings of evolution to today, it is about the growth of human consciousness. So you could argue that this is it's a natural step, actually, that 100 years from now, we might look back at it and say, this is the most obvious thing in the world. What took them so long to realize it? But to me, this is the optimistic case for where we are. And I believe that human beings do amazing things, and that we're all doing the best we can with what we know, but we just struggle to not know what we don't know. And so I look at that with compassion and with care and with just wanting to challenge my brain to what can I try to find out that makes this easier, or makes this easy is too high a bar, that makes this less difficult. I think that's the bar to meet. It makes it less difficult. And so my experience leads me in these kinds of directions.
So for a radical idea like this, how much success have you seen already? How much of influence have you had in changing the mindset? You told it takes 30 years, but have you made any meaningful dent yet? Have you gathered support for this voice?
Definitely. There's like half of the world is already cured. We're just not telling anyone yet. It takes time. It's, what I've done, I teach workshops. So I've taught this form to thousands of people at this point. So I see it as like, I can't just be the philosopher on the hill, just shouting, "Hey, I got a great idea." You have to teach it. You have to instruct it. And I learn so much from sharing it. I get to learn so much how people work, how organizations work. My respect for human beings increases every day. I share this with people. And I'll tell you, in a pre-COVID world, I was spending a lot of energy having to argue for the fact that we did have a misplaced value system. And that was a hard sell and a hard thing for a lot of people to buy. I was on CNBC yelling with talk show hosts about this. And so the idea that there was something wrong and that there was a greater potential beyond financial growth, I really... I didn't have a hard time arguing, but a lot of people really were not open to that discussion. Post-COVID, I'm overwhelmed with people wanting to talk about it. I'm overwhelmed with people reaching out, expressing their feeling that it's a map. It feels like a relevant map to how they see their lives, and wanting to do more, wanting to be more involved. So at this moment, I can feel a real momentum. And a real desire, in a way that I feel responsibility, and kind of I'm trying to respond in a way that is being responsible to this movement that I think is happening. So one of the things that changed that for me was a weekly practice I do. So I have my own bento. I have my own values. I make decisions using them. Making decisions using what I've identified as being important to me in each of those spaces. But I also do a weekly exercise where I draw a blank bento, because I'm someone that I make to-do lists. I function off of like that kind of structured way. So I make a blank bento every Sunday, and I say, what do I want to do with my energy this week? Just this week, next 7 days. And I ask my now me voice what it wants me to do, which is always like errands and work stuff. I asked my future me voice what it wants me to do. It's normally reminding me to like build these longer term relationships, or to read, to learn, to self-develop more. My now us, when I ask it what I should do with my energy, it's reminding me of all the people in my life that are important to me. Inevitably, I'm making a list of like the 4 people I feel that I care most about, that I feel least in touch with that week. And I make sure to call them. And my future us is reminding me of these larger mission I'm thinking about, this question of Bentoism, the world I want to see, and what am I doing right now to manifest that? And so, using that to ground my time every week has dramatically shaped what I do. And that, and in a COVID world, I've turned that into like a weekly Zoom call. It's normally about me and 50 other people on Sunday mornings. And the same process I would do on my own of just writing, we just do together. And so we do 10 minutes of journaling every week. And then I create a 10-minute sort of teaching or lesson that goes with it that sort of makes us more aware of what's going on. And I've now expanded those to 3 times a week. Those are now Sundays, Mondays, and then a more advanced session on Wednesdays for people who have been doing it for a while. And what's interesting is yeah, that has real momentum. And even though I'm now devoting like 3 chunks of time a week to this, it still doesn't seem like that much, in part because these are things I was already doing. And the notion of like, hey, I'll just turn the camera on. And I've made a point to like the weekly bento should never be longer than 20 minutes. Because I just think, well, I don't want to sit here for an hour, like that seems like enough time. And so it's short enough and utilitarian enough to where I am still excited to do it every week. This week will be our 9th straight week of doing it, and people keep coming back. And it's teaching a kind of a language, right? And even in these advanced settings, what we're getting into is like someone coming with a problem, they get grouped with 2 or 3 other people who help them talk it through. And eventually we're going to get to where we will know how to like be someone's future me for them. Like I'm going to be your voice. I'm going to speak back to you according to what you actually want and force you to confront yourself. And those are places we're going to be able to get as a group. So it's exciting. It's exciting. And it's, before COVID, I wasn't sure what direction this was going. I felt like the guy yelling at windmills, trying to get anyone else to care. Certainly people did care, but there's a lot of preaching to the choir that's like, honestly I don't really give a shit about. And so now this is like meaningful. It's real. I'm in a position of having helpful conversations with multiple people every week using this format. I mean, it's become very present. And so I think it will inevitably, this leads to like some, what are the next step kind of questions that I think will happen in the next, the rest of this year. But as of right now, I can feel the value and meaning it's bringing to people.
I would imagine that it would be more effective to make the new breed of entrepreneurs who are getting into businesses and train them instead of established entrepreneurs and make their changes, right? So that is going to be much more challenging than preparing the new young blood that is coming up and changing their mindset. That would be, I think, a better strategy. I have a few questions that we would open up. I know I'm just being mindful of time as well.
Yeah. I've got a couple minutes. My wife is doing childcare for me, so I'm mindful of time too, because it's almost my turn to switch back. So yeah,
we'll quickly run through a bento exercise for me, and that would give an idea of our listeners. And because you said that, let's talk about individual, right? The average common man listening to this doesn't have the influence and capacity to change how the world should function, but what he can do in personal capacity. And I think bento works for both large organizations to frame their values and also for their personal life, isn't it? So let's pick that up and let's see how it goes. So I need your help to guide me through.
Sure.
Let's share the screen here.
So can you, if you want to write it on a piece of paper, you're going to do it on the screen.
I will use the same template and maybe I'll type it down there. Are you able to your end?
Yeah, I got you. So you could just do some text box on the screen. So normally what I would have someone do is I'd say, okay, draw the 4 quadrants, in your notebook. Okay, you have this now. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to go box by box and we're going to put in there what it is that you care about that's important to you. And so we'll start with now me. And I think of now me as like the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of like safety and security. So what do most people's now me need? Well, they need, money in the bank. They need their health. They need to feel safe. They need to not be endangered. But there also may be some additional things that you need on a day-to-day basis. Maybe you need to exercise, maybe you need challenge, maybe you need the outdoors, maybe, what are those things for you? Right. So the first step of filling out the bento is for this now me, you ask yourself, what does now me want to need? And the way I think about this question is, what do I need on a daily basis to feel to feel like me, to feel not afraid, to feel okay. And so in the Now Me box, you're just simply listing those things out. And so if you want to stop there, that's fine, which is financial stability is cool. Normally it's like 5 to 7 things you're writing down.
Got it.
And just like what do you need on a day-to-day basis? So I think the Now Me things are pretty clear for most people. So future me. So to think about your future me, I imagine the older and wiser version of me. The version of me, he has, more salt than pepper in his hair. He's standing on the cliffs of time. He's got deep wrinkles. He's kind of like my own Obi-Wan Kenobi. He made all the right choices. And I'm looking at that person, I'm touching their face, I'm feeling their warmth and their kindness. And I'm asking them, what always matters? What are the lines I should never cross? What is it that must always be true of me if I am to become you? If I am to become you. And so it's a very specific ask for you. When I answered this question, things that came out were like being loyal to my values, to create harmony with people around me. My parents divorced, so I'm like always trying to bring people together. To be able to self-correct was a thing I said my future me always said was important, that I shouldn't get too stuck on certain beliefs. And so you're writing down what are those things that must always be true of me, to be me, and everyone is going to have different answers here. They might be spiritually the same, but like to be specifically Ravi, it means doing this, right? So now we go to now us.
Mm-hmm.
So to think about your now us, what I like to do is I tell people, think about everyone that you love, everyone you really care about, cram them all onto a sofa. Your pets are there too, your childhood friends, your work friends, your family, they're all there on a sofa together. These are people you love. That is your now us. And so now what we do is we just look across their faces and to see what your now us value is. It's asking, what do you bring to your relationships? What are you to your relationships? So are you a shoulder to cry on? Do you bring advice? Are you like you help people escape? Are you just hyper loyal, always there for someone? Do you bring a perspective that people wouldn't see otherwise? Are you just like full of love and compassion and care? But in particular, just trying to think, what do people expect from you as a friend, as a family member? You don't have to be everything to everybody, but you do need to be what people expect you to be, because there's probably a reason why they expect that. So the real way to do, go ahead.
What would be an example for now was like, now me is financial stability could be one, but for now us, what could be those adjectives or
my one I had for my now us was like deep time. That one of the things I thought was like, I take real pride in when I'm with someone, I'm not looking at my phone, I'm not multitasking, I'm hyper present. And that, to me, that felt critical to my relationships. And so I wrote that down as like, what is one of my values? I'm like focus time, hyper present. What I came to realize actually was that's also a limitation, because that makes me really bad at being an acquaintance. That means I could spend a weekend with you and we could have a great time, and you might text me the next day and I might never write you back. Just because like of how my now value sort of functions. But just like for you to be you, what do you have to be? What do you have to be? What is that? What do you owe to other people around you? When you think about this as an organization, it's interesting because it's like, what is our customer promise? What is our employee promise? You get into like interesting stakeholder questions. And then finally, the future us is about, you're thinking about the world for your children, and what do you want that world to be? What do you want that world to be? I wrote down, a sustainable world, a safe world, a just world. I imagine we all have fairly similar goals for what we want the world of our children to be. So you just write down, whatever things feel right to you there. The next step of this process of really honing in on your bento is you try to come up with just a simple phrase to encapsulate what's going on in each of these spaces, something that you'll remember. So like my now me value is to quote, show people the matrix. And that's what I came up for. My now me was, yes, there's money in the bank, health, all that, But like the things that felt most distinct to me were like, I really love reading about ideas, connecting ideas, talking about ideas with people, like makes me come alive. And so I ended up after some time saying, actually showing people the matrix is this thing that really like lights my now me on fire, is also what people will pay me for. It's like kind of my profession. It's like, that's kind of what my critical essence of now me is this idea of like sharing ideas that I put in a phrase that I would remember. My future me value, I shrunk that down to just simply create harmony and don't sell out. So when I make decisions, I look for, does this bring people together? Is this like, am I staying true to something here? Then yes, it's in line with me. My now us is about deep time with core friends. So when I'm making decisions, I optimize for, is this adding to deep time with those friends? Is this detracting from it? Or it's like making sure every day that there's a little bit of space, not even just a little bit, but that there is space set aside for now us. That kind of, I've come to think of it as like, a good day for me is a day where I manage to do something in each one of these spaces. And my future us is about building a better matrix. It's saying there is still the matrix where choices are being made for us, but how can that evolve to be more broadly helpful rather than being kind of extractive as the matrix is right now? These were just phrases that like would just help me keep these ideas in mind. They're like icons in my brain. In fact, the way I've been making bentos lately, because like I've been making famous people's bentos, not with them, but like as a way of trying to analyze them. So I recently made like Madonna's bento or like Apple's bento. And those I've started illustrating, actually, using pictures to show what the values are, because there is an energy that comes out too. But so I think the way to think about this is you create this map. Here are the dimensions of myself. These are the voices that are talking to me, whether I listen to them or not. If I know what they're saying and I know what they want, then that gives me the ability to create coherence, to answer them, to create solutions that feed them. And what you find is that when you make decisions that answer your bento, that fulfill all these spaces, that's when you are in a flow state. That's a flow state, right? We know what it is to be a flow state in nature, exercising, with music or art, something like that. But to be in a flow state on a weekday afternoon, when you have work to do, it's a harder place to be. But this gives you a map of what that is, and what it just creates agency. It creates agency. I feel like I am no longer beholden to events happening around me. Like I have my plans, and they have to change all the time. But I have my plans that I'm working on, even as the world has its own. And that's so few people have that. So like what an advantage it is. What an advantage it is to have expanded your perimeter. Like you're really operating on a different level than everyone around you. And it just takes a little bit of practice, but it's trivial. It's trivial. I mean, this weekly bento thing, that's 20 minutes. It's like 20 minutes a week. Plus you look at it maybe twice more. You're talking maybe 30 minutes a week. And I would guess that as a result of that 30 minutes, that the percentage of your life force that is being used for something that you actually want will increase many times. And awareness is just amazing. And this just speaks to the fact that we are essentially good, and that our capacity is amazing, and that we just every now and then we need tools, loving tools, to equip us to be who we actually need to be.
Right.
And it's possible. It's possible. Yeah.
I was floored when I saw this little tool, and I'm going to use this every week. Let's see how it goes. I would still be a novice, but if people want to know more about this, you do workshops. But are these workshops open or?
They're open to anybody. They generally happen on Sundays and Mondays at noon Eastern. So there is some time zone. There's a lot of people in Asia that have been wanting to join that I haven't found a good time to do that yet. We will work on that. But yeah, they're totally open. I have just bit.ly/weekly bento, bit.ly/weekly bento. You can just add your email address. I'm about to send the invite for this week's here today. But yeah, you just sign up for that email address. Every week I send, okay, here's the schedule for the coming week's events. I never promote it beyond that channel. So these events are all meant to be sacred, intimate spaces where people can be real and vulnerable. And it's people from all around the world, every nationality, ethnicity you can imagine are there together. And so it's tremendous. It's tremendous.
I will show it on
It's exceeded my expectations. Yeah.
bit.ly/weekly
/weekly weekly bento.
So, all right. We'll quickly do questions, and we have to be very, very brief with the answers. And then we can
Yeah. Then I hear my child crying in the other room.
let's quickly go through the list. So what has happened is, Rajesh says hello, Ravi and Yancey, and then Preeti says hi, Yancey. Great opportunity to watch you live. Rajesh says Yancey is an inspiration, 1 in a billion. The food analogy was great. Yeah. So, where do you think money will lead the most to the current shift in the market? Yeah.
Well, I think money will continue to be the dominant value system, but it will no longer be a monopolist. Like if you think about it, money has a monopoly on value today. It is the only thing it's pegged to. But what will happen as our metrics expand, as our dashboard expands, is that the universal dominance of financial value as a metric will decrease, and it will be forced to compete. It will be forced to compete with other value systems to distribute goods and services. So I think what you'll find is that money will actually probably become more performative and more reflective of what we want it to be by virtue of other metrics sort of pushing against it. I think that like the effect of crypto on on fiat currencies is tremendous, right? It's created a point of comparison. Look at the absurdity of how these things function versus how this functions. And so I think I think money will still be dominant, but that say in 30 years, that money will be one of 5 metrics that everyone agrees is critical. And yes, it's maybe like the table stakes one that everything else is perhaps built on top of. But it will exist inside a suite of other things rather than being the only thing we think matters.
Nice. And in the upcoming world, which kind of businesses or firms do we need?
Well, I think that I'm a big believer in more shared ownership models, in cooperatives, especially as a business model. I think is particularly exciting. I think that the degree of the inequality of this economic crisis shows the degree to which ownership is concentrated in a very small number of hands. And this is the thing that the internet can solve. Like imagining an Instagram where all the users collectively own and govern Instagram is possible. And I work with a company called Ampled that's doing exactly something like that for musicians. So I think cooperative ownership is going to be a key part of creating more equitable systems in the future.
Excellent. One last question and then we'll go. Basically, what should be the spirit of an entrepreneur? This comes from R.R. Mohanty, sales or production or finance?
I think the spirit of an entrepreneur is value, creating value. And it's creating value, not capturing value. I was very affected by being in New York City in the early 2000s when Napster changed the music industry. When I first went to New York, there were record stores everywhere. During the first 10 years there, I saw almost all of them close. And what was notable was that as digital music emerged, all the first stores to close were the chains, the large chains that were the biggest music stores in the city. But what this revealed was that they just happened to be a retailer that sold music. That wasn't really what they cared about. And so that they didn't have an audience that was there to support them through that change. The stores that did last the longest were the record stores focused on classical music and jazz and punk and indie, ones that served a specific market and that created value beyond just being a retailer. beyond just like making more in sales than they did in rent. And because they added that other value, cultural value, social value, discovery value, they were still meaningful and they were able to survive an apocalypse in their industry. And so these apocalyptic moments are happening now. They're going to increase. Like COVID is an appetizer for the climate crisis. These apocalyptic events are going to increase. So what will survive are going to be businesses that provide value, to people. And that value, as measured by amount of money you keep for yourself, will even be a negative value in considering this context. So I think it is to make a business that is being value creating, and that for all the value you put in the world, you should be taking back for yourself a much smaller amount. Like Kickstarter's fee is 5%. There's no revenue source beyond that. We were always proud of that. The fact that like Pebble and some of these big projects have made more money through Kickstarter than the company itself does, to me is an example of the value that it provides and the sign of a good business, the sign of a business that will last. And lasting is the goal. Lasting is the goal.
Excellent. Well, Yancey, thank you so much. This was quite inspiring conversation, and I'm waiting for 2030 when your ideas become mainstream, and I will look to that and also contribute actively, not just be a watcher, but I will do all my best to be part of this and engage this, and in my own little way spread this word. And you have already collaborated with me, and I hope this message reaches lots of more people, especially in India, where there's a bunch of new entrepreneurs with lots of ideas and aspirations. They get to imbibe your ideas and make the world a better place. Thank you, Yancey, for your time.
Yeah, thanks you much, and thanks to people for tuning in. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye, Yancey.
All right, take care.